Introduce the grandma, once a joyful, spirited young woman, now carrying the invisible scars of a life not chosen. Set the tone with empathy and curiosity. When you look at her now, you might just see an old woman. Gray hair tied back, quiet eyes that have seen too much, and hands worn with time. She laughs sometimes, and when she does, it's soft, like she's afraid of taking up too much space. But if you sit close long enough, you'll notice something behind that smile. A kind of sadness that never quite fades. I didn't always understand it. As a child, I thought she was just tired. Now I know better. That woman is my grandmother. And behind her gentle silence is a true story, one that she carried alone for most of her life. She never spoke much about her past when I was young. Whenever someone asked about her younger days, she'd brush it off with a little wave of her hand. Those were different times, she'd say. And that was it. But one night a few years ago, I saw her sitting at the kitchen table alone. She was staring into her tea like it held memories she hadn't let out in decades. I sat with her, and for the first time, she let the truth slip through the cracks. She told me she was 17 when they told her she was getting married. Not asked, told. No warning. No choice. No questions about how she felt or what she wanted. Just, this is the man. The wedding is next month. Her voice didn't shake when she said it, but I felt the weight of it, heavy like a stone in my chest. It was the way she said it, not bitter, not angry, just resigned. Like she'd made peace with something that should never have happened in the first place. Her parents, my great-grandparents, weren't cruel people. At least not intentionally. They believed they were doing what was right, what was expected. There was pressure from the community, from tradition, from fear of gossip or judgment. And in that moment, her feelings became secondary to what everyone else thought was best. She was just a girl. Daughter. Piece on someone else's chessboard. She told me she didn't even see his face until the day they got engaged. When she met him, she knew. There was something in his eyes, a hardness, a lack of softness, that told her she wasn't walking into a marriage, but into a life sentence. But her protests were silenced with the same few lines. You'll learn to love him. This is for your own good. We know what's best for you. She tried to argue once, she said, but the look on her father's face shut her down. And she never tried again. That moment was the start of a lifetime of silence. What struck me most that night wasn't just what happened to her. It was how she talked about it. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for pity. She just told her story like it was the weather, like something that had happened and couldn't be changed. And maybe that's what made it hit even harder. She had accepted her pain because it had been dismissed for so long. She'd convinced herself it didn't matter anymore. But it did matter. It matters because her story isn't just hers. It's the story of so many women whose voices were taken from them before they even had the chance to find them. Women who were told that love wasn't necessary, that respect was optional, and that obedience was a virtue. Women who smiled through pain and swallowed their screams because speaking out would bring shame, not to their abuser but to themselves. It matters because when we tell these stories, when we pull back the curtain, we see the damage that silence can do. And we start to understand that tradition isn't always sacred. Sometimes it's just old pain wearing a new face. That night, I looked at my grandmother differently. Not as someone fragile or passive, but as someone incredibly strong. Not because she endured what she did, but because she survived it and still found a way to love, to laugh, and to raise a family without letting bitterness consume her. But the truth is, she should have never had to survive in the first place. No one should. And the most heartbreaking part. She thought her story didn't matter. That it was too late to tell it. But it's not too late. Never is. Because every time we speak up, every time we share a truth that's been buried, we break the cycle just a little more. She looked at me that night and said, maybe I was too quiet for too long. I took her hand and told her, your voice still matters. It always has. She told me the wedding dress wasn't white, it was beige. Not because she chose it that way but because it was borrowed. Someone else's dress for someone else's joy. She stood there, 17, wrapped in a future she never asked for, while people clapped and smiled around her. To them it was a celebration. To her it felt like a funeral. Only she was still alive. That's the part people don't always see. We romanticize weddings, don't we? The music, the flowers, the food, the promises. But what happens when those promises are forced? What happens when the bride isn't in love, isn't ready, and isn't even asked? That's what happened to her. My grandmother. Her wedding day was not about her. It was about everyone else. About appearances. About tradition. About control. She said there was no moment when she said yes. No proposal, no decision. Just a sentence. You're marrying him. And suddenly her life was no longer hers. I asked her why she didn't fight harder. And she looked at me, not with anger, but with that deep, exhausted look that only people who have been betrayed by those they trust the most can carry. Because when your own family pushes you, she said, there's nowhere to run. Her parents weren't the villains of her story in the way we might expect. They didn't scream at her or lock her in a room. They just insisted. Gently, firmly, endlessly. It started with quiet conversations. He has a good job. His family is respected. You'll be secure. Then came the warnings. Don't embarrass us. What will people say? Girls who argue end up alone. Over time the pressure was so constant, so heavy that it didn't feel like pressure anymore. Felt like truth. And when the people you trust the most all agree on one version of your future, you start to believe that resistance is wrong. That your fear is overreaction. That your instincts are just immaturity. That was the trap. Not chains, not locks. Just quiet coercion wrapped in care. It's the kind of control that leaves no bruises but breaks you anyway. She said she remembered the exact moment it became real. Her mother was sewing the hem of the borrowed dress, humming like it was a normal day. And she stood there watching, waiting for someone to stop to say, "Is this really what you want?" But no one did. That question never came. So she stopped waiting. She stopped hoping. She shut it all down like turning off a light, and walked straight into a life she didn't choose. Strange how easily people justified it. It was the way things were. Girls didn't date back then. You were lucky he wanted to marry you. They said all of that like it excused the absence of consent. But just because something is common doesn't mean it's right. Just because it's accepted doesn't make it harmless. And even now, all these years later, the part that hurt her the most wasn't the man she was forced to marry. It was the people who forced her to marry him. The ones who were supposed to protect her, nurture her, fight for her dreams. They were the ones who handed her over. Not out of hate but out of fear. Fear of shame. Fear of judgment. Fear of a daughter who might choose her own path and make people talk. She once told me, "I didn't stop loving them. But something inside me stopped trusting them." And that hit me in a way I can't explain. 'Cause how do you heal from that? How do you carry on when the people who taught you right from wrong decide that your freedom is worth less than their reputation? And the worst part is, they didn't even see it. To them it was normal. Expected. This is how life works. You'll learn. You'll adjust. And she did. Not because she wanted to. Because she had no other choice. But I think part of her never forgave them for that. Not because they were cruel but because they were blind. Blind to her fear. Blind to her silence. Blind to the fact that they were not protecting her. They were delivering her into harm's way. It wasn't just a wedding. It was the moment her voice was taken from her. It was the moment her story stopped being hers and started being written by other people. And maybe that's why it took her so long to speak about it. Because when the betrayal comes from within your own family, it's not just pain, it's confusion. It's loss. It's learning to live with a wound that looks like love from the outside. She never wanted pity. She just wanted someone to see the truth of what happened. To say, "That was wrong. You deserved better." So let me be the one to say it tonight. For her, and for every woman whose no was ignored. You deserved better. She said the first time he hit her, it wasn't with his hands. It was with his words. Sharp, sudden, and calculated. She had been married to him for just 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Long enough for the guests to go home and the congratulations to die down. Long enough for the masks to come off. Started small. He'd criticize the way she folded the laundry. Then it was her cooking, her voice, the way she looked at him. And every time she tried to explain or defend herself, he twisted it, turned it back on her. You're too sensitive. You're lucky I even tolerate you. You wouldn't survive a day without me. She said she began to doubt her own thoughts, her own feelings. She wasn't just being hurt, she was being erased. Eventually, the words turned into slammed doors, lap plates, pushed shoulders. Then came the bruises. Not often enough that anyone would ask questions, but just enough that she stopped looking people in the eyes. She became a master of hiding things, her pain, her fear, her truth. It wasn't just survival. It was how she learned to exist. I asked her once, "Why didn't you leave?" And she gave me a look. Not of anger but of exhaustion. The kind of look that says, "You really think it was that simple?" She didn't have money. She didn't have support. And worse, she didn't have permission. From her family, her community, even herself. She had been taught that marriage was forever, no matter what. That a good woman endures. That private problems stay behind closed doors. But behind those doors, she was falling apart. She said the worst part wasn't the violence. It was the loneliness. She would lie in bed at night, next to the man who hurt her, and feel more invisible than ever. Like she was disappearing a little more every day. And the silence was suffocating. No one asked. No one offered help. Some probably knew, she said, but they looked the other way. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they thought it wasn't their place. Or maybe they believed the same lie she had been told, that this was just what marriage looked like sometimes. She remembered once, early on, she did try to talk to her mother. Not about everything, just enough to test the waters. And her mother told her, "Be patient. All men are like that in the beginning. Just give it time." And that was it. That was the last time she reached out. She realized then that no one was coming to save her. She would have to carry this alone. And so she did. She became an expert at pretending. She smiled when guests came over. She made tea. She tucked her bruises under sleeves and wrapped her voice in calm. Because if she broke, who would be there to pick up the pieces? She had to keep going even when it felt impossible. And the thing is, when you live in fear long enough, it becomes part of your routine. You stop hoping for escape. You just try not to provoke. You monitor the temperature of the room, the tone of his voice, the tension in his shoulders. You live your life constantly calculating how to avoid the next explosion. It's not a life. It's a prison with no bars. And yet somehow she survived it. Day after day. Year after year. But survival came at a cost. Her laughter got quieter. Her dreams faded into the background. She forgot what peace felt like. She told me that sometimes when the house was quiet and he was gone, she'd sit in the kitchen and just breathe. Not because anything was particularly good in that moment, but because for once, nothing hurt. She said, "You learn to celebrate the absence of pain when that's all you have." That line stayed with me. The absence of pain. That was the highest hope she allowed herself. Not joy. Not freedom. Just a moment of stillness without fear. And I think about that often. How many women live like that right now? Hiding. Enduring. Smiling when they want to scream. How many grandmothers, mothers, daughters have stories they've buried so deep they barely remember the sound of their own voice? We see these women at family gatherings. We sit next to them in waiting rooms. And we never know. Because they've been taught to carry it quietly. But here's the truth. Silence does not mean safety. Smiles do not mean peace. And just because someone stays doesn't mean they are okay. She wasn't okay. But she stayed because that's what she was taught. And that's what breaks my heart the most. Not just that she suffered, but that she believed suffering was her duty. She lived for years in that quiet hell. Not because she was weak, but because the world around her refused to make space for her voice. She once told me that the only thing that kept her going during those years was her children. Not because they made life easier, they didn't. Not because they brought peace, because peace didn't exist in that house, but because they gave her a reason, a thread of purpose to hold on to when everything else was falling apart. When she became a mother, she was still just a girl herself. 19 years old, already married for nearly 2 years, and already carrying scars no one else could see. She said holding her first baby in her arms was the first time she'd felt anything close to love in a long, long time. Not the kind that hurts, not the kind that controls, but something pure, something new. And for a moment, it gave her hope that maybe this life could be more than just survival. But even that joy came with its own weight. Because while the world celebrated her growing family, behind closed doors, nothing changed. The man who hurt her didn't soften when the babies came. If anything, the pressure got worse. The stress, the demands, the anger. She had to learn how to shield a tiny, innocent life from the very environment she herself had no escape from. She said it felt like standing in front of a fire with your arms stretched wide, trying to block the flames from reaching someone smaller than you, knowing full well they'd still get burned. She'd stay up all night with a crying baby, then get blamed the next morning because the house wasn't clean enough or the food wasn't ready fast enough. There were no thank yous, no help, no kindness, just a relentless cycle of work, fear, and silence. And through all of that, she never let her children see her break. She smiled for them. She read them stories. She kissed their foreheads and told them they were safe, even when she didn't believe it herself. I think that's what made her a warrior. Not the loud kind, the kind in armor, but the quiet kind, the kind who fights battles no one sees, who bleeds invisibly, who endures quietly, not for herself but for the people she loves. She said every time he raised his voice or slammed a door, she flinched, not just out of fear for herself, but out of fear that the children would see, that they would learn that this was normal, that they'd grow up thinking love looks like control, or that silence equals peace. She fought every single day not just to survive him, but to protect her kids from becoming like him, or believing they deserved someone like him. And yet, there were times she couldn't hide it. Times the shouting echoed through the walls. Times her tears fell before she could wipe them away. And the guilt she carried for those moments, it never left her. She said the hardest part of being a mother in an abusive marriage wasn't the abuse. It was pretending it wasn't happening. Pretending she could keep it from touching them, when deep down she knew it already had. She didn't have the luxury of falling apart. She couldn't leave. Not then, not with nowhere to go and mouths to feed. So she did what so many women do. She endured. She gave every ounce of her strength to her children. And somehow, through all of that pain, she still raised them with tenderness, with patience, with a kind of love that was fierce and selfless and unconditional. I once asked her how she managed to love so fully when she'd been given so little. And she said, "Because I wanted them to feel what I never did. I wanted them to know they mattered." That was her rebellion, her quiet revolution. She took all the pain that was poured into her and somehow turned it into love. She broke the pattern even if no one noticed at the time. There's something so powerful about that kind of strength, the kind that doesn't make headlines, the kind that doesn't ask for praise, the kind that rocks a baby with bruised arms, the kind that sings lullabies with a broken heart, the kind that stays up all night worrying, not about herself, but about whether her kids will grow up feeling whole. She told me once that the only thing she ever truly feared wasn't her husband. It was the idea that her children might grow up and repeat the same cycle. That they'd think this is what love looks like. That they'd choose silence over truth, endurance over freedom. And so she made sure every chance she got to teach them different. Not with lectures but with how she loved them. How she showed up every single day, even when she had nothing left. And that's what I remember most about her. Not her pain but her perseverance. Not the darkness she lived through, but the light she somehow gave anyway. There came a moment, years later after the children were grown, after the house had become quiet and the shouting had faded into memory, when she finally allowed herself to ask a question she had buried for decades. What about me? That was the beginning of something new. Not a dramatic turning point. Not a movie scene with fireworks and declarations. Just a quiet shift. A whisper inside her that had been silent for so long, finally finding its voice. It didn't happen overnight. Healing rarely does. For women like my grandmother, who lived so many years just trying to stay alive, healing isn't a straight line. It's more like walking barefoot across broken glass, slow, painful, and uncertain. She had spent so long putting everyone else first, so long hiding her pain, that when she finally had the chance to breathe, she didn't even know what to do with it. She told me she felt guilty at first. Isn't that something? Guilt for surviving, for making it through, for still having pieces of herself left. It's one of the cruelest tricks of abuse, that even when the abuser is gone, their voice lives on inside you. Every time she tried to do something for herself, buy a new dress, take a walk alone, speak up, there was a voice in her head telling her she didn't deserve it, that she was selfish, that no one wanted to hear what she had to say. But slowly, she began to unlearn that voice. She started small. She went to the library and got books just for her, not for anyone else. She started keeping a notebook where she wrote down memories, not just the hard ones but the good ones too. She spent mornings sitting in the sun, sipping her tea slowly, not rushing, not hurrying to meet anyone else's needs, just being still, just existing. That was her revolution. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She reclaimed her life piece by piece, day by day. And somewhere in the middle of that process she started talking. Not in whispers, not in apology, but in truth. She told her story not just to me but to others. Women at church, neighbors, even strangers. And what shocked her most was how many of them nodded in quiet recognition. They hadn't lived the exact same story, but they knew the silence. They knew the fear. They knew what it meant to survive something no one else ever saw. She began to understand that what had happened to her wasn't her fault. That what she endured wasn't love. That her silence hadn't been weakness. It had been the only protection she had at the time. And when she forgave herself, that's when real healing began. There was this one moment I'll never forget. She was in her 70s by then. We were sitting on the porch, just the two of us, watching the sky turn orange as the sun went down. I asked her if she ever regretted not leaving earlier. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I regret believing I couldn't." And something about that broke me. Because she wasn't just talking about leaving a man. She was talking about leaving the idea that she wasn't allowed to want more. That she wasn't allowed to have dreams, to feel safe, to be free. That belief had held her prisoner long after the violence had ended. But by the time she said those words, she had already started to rewrite the ending of her own story. She was no longer just someone who endured. She had become someone who chose, who rebuilt, who spoke. She didn't need validation or attention. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She just wanted to live the rest of her life in truth. And even though her body had aged, her spirit, my God, her spirit was strong. There was a clarity in her eyes that only comes from someone who has walked through hell and come out still holding light. Sometimes, healing isn't about fixing everything. It's about learning to live fully with the parts that remain. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself that were taken from you. And watching her do that, in her own quiet, steady way, changed the way I see strength. She used to think her story didn't matter, that it was too ordinary, too painful, too old. But I saw the way people leaned in when she spoke. I saw the way other women's eyes filled with tears, just knowing they weren't alone. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't age, doesn't lose power. It just waits for someone brave enough to speak it. And in the final chapters of her life, she became that someone. Not because she owed it to anyone, but because she finally realized she owed it to herself. I think what still amazes me most is how, after everything, she didn't let bitterness take root in her. You'd think someone who endured the things she did, being silenced, controlled, hurt by the very people who were supposed to love and protect her, would have every right to be angry. And she did feel that anger, of course she did. But she didn't let it define her. She didn't let it harden her. Instead, she turned it into something softer, something braver, something stronger. It wasn't forgiveness in the simple storybook way. She didn't forget. She didn't excuse. But she forgave because she refused to let pain be the last word in her life. She told me, "If I stay angry forever, then he still wins. They still win." And I remember thinking, how can someone who has every reason to shut the world out still choose to open herself to it? She chose healing. Not once, not in a grand moment, but again and again, day after day. It was in how she treated people, in how she listened, in how she raised her voice, not in volume but in truth. By the time I was old enough to really understand what she had been through, she had become the person everyone went to for advice. And I used to wonder, how could she be so calm, so wise, when life had once tried so hard to break her? The answer, I think, is that she didn't just survive her pain. She grew from it. She used it. Not to get even, but to reach others. To let them know they weren't alone. To show that even the deepest wounds don't have to define who we are. She told her story not because she wanted sympathy, but because she knew the cost of silence. She had lived it. She didn't want anyone else to feel trapped in the same kind of quiet that once surrounded her. And people listened. Her story, this quiet, complicated, deeply human story, had a way of opening other people up. I watched it happen so many times. A woman would come over to borrow something or drop off a pie, and they'd end up sitting at the kitchen table for hours, sharing things they hadn't told anyone else. Because somehow my grandmother made them feel safe. She created the kind of space she never had for herself, a space where it was okay to say, "I'm not okay." That was her power. That was her legacy. She didn't wear it like a crown. She wore it like a quiet strength in her eyes, in the way she sat with people, in the way she never rushed anyone's pain. And she didn't just stop with her own generation. She taught me, and others, to look for the signs, to listen without judgment, to speak up even when it's uncomfortable. Because that's the other thing about healing, it's not just about us. It ripples, teaches, breaks cycles. And my grandmother, without even realizing it at first, became a cycle breaker. She couldn't go back and undo the harm that had been done to her. But she could make damn sure that harm didn't continue through her. Through us. She raised her children with love, not fear. She taught them to speak, not shrink. And she taught me that strength isn't about how loud you are or how tough you seem. Real strength is choosing to build when everything around you has tried to tear you down. Real strength is deciding your story doesn't end with pain, even if that's where it started. Even near the end of her life, when her body grew tired, her spirit never did. She kept learning. She kept showing up. She kept sharing her story, her lessons, her quiet, fierce resilience. She never stopped growing. That, to me, is the ultimate proof that healing is possible. Not when someone escapes without scars, but when they find a way to live fully in spite of them. She taught me that healing doesn't mean pretending it never happened. It means standing in your truth and still choosing to love, to trust, to hope. It means refusing to let what was done to you decide who you become. And if there's one thing I hope you carry with you from her story, it's this. You are not what hurt you. You are not the worst thing that ever happened to you. You are not the silence that was forced on you. You are what you choose to do next. You are the love you give anyway. The truth you speak anyway. The healing you claim anyway. That's what she gave me. That's what she gave all of us.